Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. Before we start, I just want to note that you will hear some background noise on this episode, and I apologize for that, but my guest was at the Sundance Film Festival, and we luckily managed to find some time to talk, even though it was in a bit of a crowded area. Regardless, you should be able to hear her just fine. Now, let's get to it. We're back to regularly scheduled programming, so this week on the show, we'll travel back in time to the landmark 50th Academy Awards, which awarded the films of 1977. Fresh off his low-budget coming-of-age story American Graffiti, George Lucas went in the complete opposite direction as he created what would come to be known as one of the most iconic, influential films of all time, Star Wars. Set in a galaxy far, far away, the film made a huge impression on audiences of all ages and became a bona fide sensation that launched an epic franchise. The film went on to become one of few sci-fi films to be nominated for Best Picture and took home a slew of Oscars in the craft categories. But it was the decidedly understated Annie Hall that took the Best Picture prize in the end. So why did Star Wars come up short in the end? We'll explore all this and more as we discuss how the Oscar almost went to Star Wars. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. We're back with regular episodes. This is Season 3, and today we'll be talking about the landmark 50th Academy Awards. And it had a very interesting lineup because we had Annie Hall versus Star Wars, in addition to 3 other movies that maybe haven't held up as much. But here we are, and of course we are talking about a little movie called Star Wars. And to help usher in this new season, I brought in an old favorite here for her 3rd time. This is the first person who's been on a regular episode for a 3rd time, so congratulations on that. From AwardsCircuit, and from the Watch and Talk podcast, from Citizen Dame, from all sorts of things, please welcome back Karen Peterson.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Yes. And you, we should say, are at Sundance as we speak.
I am.
So that is very exciting. How are things going there?
Good. I'm a little tired. I had about 4 hours of sleep, which I think is actually just a nap. But it's been good. I've seen some good stuff so far. And yeah, got more coming. I'm going to be here all week. So
excellent. So, are we ready to travel back in time 42 years?
Let's do it.
Okay, because today we are indeed talking about Star Wars, which was later, of course, titled Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, but at the time it was just Star Wars. So it is, of course, an epic sci-fi film set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, about a young, seemingly ordinary man named Luke Skywalker who discovers his destiny by going on a perilous adventure to destroy the evil Galactic Empire's Death Star, which has the power to annihilate entire planets. And so he teams up with a ragtag group of rebels, including the mystical Obi-Wan Kenobi, the droids C-3PO and R2-D2, mercenary Han Solo and his sidekick Chewbacca, and the badass Princess Leia, key figure in the rebellion, and really helps kickstart this entire journey. And our heroes have to basically fend off an entire supply of stormtroopers and the Empire's evil leaders, Grand Moff Tarkin, and of course, Darth Vader. So the film was written and directed by George Lucas and stars Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Harrison Ford as Han Solo, Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, Kenny Baker as R2-D2, Peter Mayhew as Chewbacca, Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin, and David Prowse as Darth Vader, who is also voiced by James Earl Jones. So Star Wars made $307 million at the box office in 1977, and it has has since extended up to 460 million, thanks to re-releases in 1982 and 1997. And it broke the record for highest grossing movie of all time at that time, which of course would be surpassed by others. But it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, winning 6 on top of a Special Achievement Award, but not Best Picture. So, Karen Peterson, tell me about your relationship with Star Wars.
Wow. So I actually have a little bit of an unusual story here because it's the first movie I ever saw in the theater. And it's because my parents couldn't find a babysitter. I was just a few months old. I slept through the whole thing until the big battle with the Death Star. And I woke up and my mom says that I cheered and clapped and just had a good old time. So basically it's been my favorite movie ever since. And as a kid, my brother and I, like my dad had made this, he had copied it. So we had a bootlegged VHS copy and we would watch it all the time. We watched that usually instead of Saturday morning cartoons. And yeah, so I have a long history with Star Wars.
And this one in particular compared to the rest of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as a movie, I think Empire Strikes Back is better for a lot of reasons. One biggest one being probably that George Lucas didn't actually write it. But yeah, like this movie is so special to me, and I actually have the DVD that has the original theatrical version on it, so it still says Star Wars, doesn't say A New Hope, and yeah, and
there's no like inserted, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's as it was presented in 1977, so and 1982.
Right. Well, I have a very interesting relationship with Star Wars as well because, believe it or not, we were not a Star Wars family growing up. It just wasn't a thing that really penetrated our household in particular for whatever reason. I genuinely don't know why. But I had first seen Star Wars as a teenager, so it wasn't one of these things that I saw at a very young age that really like jump-started my interest in film or anything of that nature. But I was still able to really appreciate it just on a pure emotional level. The amount of fun in this movie, I think, cannot be undersold. It's just kind of a blast from start to finish, and even the menacing elements of the Empire, it's still just this great, like, elemental, basic good and evil story that just works, especially when you're young. But I feel like even if you are an older person, you can still kind of appreciate some of the, I guess, like the allusions to older film, even like the Buck Rogers aspect of things and the Flash Gordon, that sort of thing. So I think it's really a movie that has commented a lot on the past, taken some allusions from the past, but also has ushered in so much of the future. So it's such a fascinating like inflection point, this movie. So
yeah, it really is. And I mean, Spielberg is credited with the first blockbuster with Jaws, but Star Wars changed film forever. And so much of where we're at now with sci-fi, with fantasy, even with drama and comedy, so many elements can trace their roots back to George Lucas and Star Wars. And I mean, it created a whole vocabulary, and so much of how special effects are done and how characters and worlds are built are because of Star Wars.
Right, exactly. And I also think some of that is just the performances themselves, even though they may not have gotten much credit with the Oscars, except for Alec Guinness. I think the young performers here they're just the best, really. Like, it's just so much fun to see the three of them bounce off each other, which is, I'm talking about, of course, Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and the late Carrie Fisher. And like, even the chemistry between Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher is just like electrifying right off the bat.
It is. It really is. And one of the things I love about the way Harrison Ford plays the part is like anything that you hear about his experience when he was actually filming it, he was like, "This movie is ridiculous. This is kind of silly," and he totally plays it that way, and it works so well.
Exactly. Yeah, he has a really fun, goofy energy to him that just kind of
Mhm.
works for this kind of roguish role. And so, like, I think honestly, some of the funniest moments in the film actually do come from him. Like, there's just this great part where he's like in the control room and like he's just trying to like pretend obviously that he's part of the stormtroopers and everything, and eventually he just goes, "How are you?" And he just like has this look on his face afterwards that's just like, "Oh god, what am I doing?"
Exactly.
And he's so
Yeah,
good with that.
he is. There's all those great moments, and also he gets to be kind of this voice of, not necessarily voice of reason, but voice of like the other opinion, I guess. Like not just ready to just gung ho jump into all this, craziness, but he's just like, well, let's just step back here. Why are we getting involved in this fight?
Right, exactly. So Mark Hamill has gotten some people love him, some people think he's does not really work, especially in this particular movie. We should mention that this was kind of his film debut, and so he was very new to the scene, and I think there was some criticism of kind of his weird energy that he has. Some people didn't feel like he fit or whatever the case may be. But what do we think of what Mark Hamill brings to this first film?
I actually love what he did. The thing is that it's not Mark Hamill. It's Luke Skywalker.
Hmm.
He's whiny and impulsive and just a little bit spoiled, probably because he has an aunt and uncle who raised him and were trying to be very protective. And this is his first time having some freedom, and yeah, so I think that it's actually credit to Mark Hamill that he was able to embrace that and do it so well. And he is this hero, Luke Skywalker is, but at the same time, it's almost accidental. Like everything he's able to accomplish is because of other people that are there helping guide him and helping pitch in along the way. I mean, to the point where he literally has to be saved, in the end.
Right.
But yeah, I think that the criticisms toward Mark Hamill are unfair. I think any criticisms about that really need to be levied at Luke.
Right, yeah. It's really a character more than what he's
Mm-hmm.
in particular doing. And he does
Yeah.
make some like odd choices like after I mean, it's not really a spoiler at this point since pretty much everyone and their mother has seen Star Wars, especially this first one, but especially at the end where Obi-Wan Kenobi is sacrificed, let's say. And he just kind of like stands there with all the stormtroopers firing at him, and he's just like trying to kill all of them and is very much like in harm's way and won't get on the Millennium Falcon.
Yeah, he's this emotional kid who never learned how to deal with anything because he never had to deal with anything.
Right.
And what I love too is, without going too much into later films, but with The Last Jedi, that character trait actually carries through. Like he's still, as a much older, much wiser, much more grizzled person, he is still a little bit that whiny Luke that we've known from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I love that because it's so true to who he was.
Yeah, you can't change that much even if you've grown,
Exactly.
so and let's just talk about the production elements of the film, because certainly all of the technical elements swept the Oscars for good reason. And for me, what stood out to me just watching it again was the art direction itself, the production design. It's really creating this whole other world, but also it's a world that feels very lived in. It feels kind of rusty, and it's not kind of the shiny plastic futuristic stuff that we would see a lot from these kinds of sci-fi movies at the time. And I know it's like in a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago, but it's some people kind of conflate that with it being sort of futuristic in a way. But I really have to commend everyone involved in really just creating such a distinct world, especially with all the weird little creatures that are sometimes scary, but also like really intriguing, especially like in the cantina band and everything that's going on there is just so bizarre, but quirky and lovable at the same time. And
yeah, the production design of this is really fun to examine, to really look at, because they took some places that actually already existed, like where the Skywalkers live is, you can actually stay there. It's a hotel in Tunisia, um, and it's built underground because of the heat, and so that's just a fun place that they found. But then there's all this cool stuff like the Jawa's big transport thing and the Death Star and all these things that have never been seen anywhere. They didn't exist anywhere, that are created for this new universe. And it's all part of what makes this such an intriguing film and such a great start to this franchise, and why it has had such an impact, because it's all part of that world building. And yeah, some of the sets are so fun. Like, I love the Millennium Falcon, and I swear, even now, I've seen them. I literally cannot even guess how many times I've seen Star Wars, and there's still things that I notice that I've never noticed before on the Millennium Falcon. And my brother had one growing up.
of course, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just all those fun details. I love it. The costume design is interesting and fun. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, there's just so much great stuff that goes into the production of this movie
Right.
that yeah, I still love looking at analyzing the details, and like you mentioned, the fact that it's such a lived-in world. um yeah, I love how intentional that was, that they really didn't want it to be this glossy, shiny future. um, they really wanted to, because it makes it more believable. It makes the characters more believable. It makes it more understandable why, even without knowing anything about him, why Han Solo would be the smuggler and running away from, henchmen and stuff and bounty hunters. And because this world is gritty and dirty, and there's bad, and there's good too, but it's just a very full, very developed galaxy.
Yeah, and you could tell that everyone involved really took a lot of care into trying to create that lived-in world. And I feel like it's definitely the kind of film that could have gone very, very wrong at various stages of production, starting with pre-production, really.
And they had a lot of things go wrong.
Well, yes,
All
that's
kinds
true.
of stories. Yeah.
Yeah,
But even before pre-production, when George Lucas was just writing the script, I don't know if you saw the documentary Spielberg
I
that
did not yet.
was on HBO.
Wanted
Oh, I
to.
love it.
Yeah.
As a child of the '80s, like, that documentary meant a lot to me. But it's just it's funny because there's a story that Spielberg talks about, where George Lucas first showed him the script for Star Wars, and it was like a group of people. There were like 5 or 6 other directors that were part of this, and he just kind of passed it out like, "Hey guys, this is what I've been working on. What do you think?" And everyone except for Spielberg was like, "This is crap. What are you thinking? Like, this is garbage." And Spielberg was like, "Well, let's see what we can do with this."
There you go.
So, yeah. So even just as it was in development, people were telling him, "Don't do this. This is going to kill your career."
Right.
Well, joke was on then.
Very much so. And a lot of the studios, too, that just passed on the film. They were just like, this is ridiculous. This is, it's for children. And also, like, George Lucas had done American Graffiti a few years before this, and there was some hope for people around him that he could do something that's, like, really more deep and, like, about real people and things like that. And he just goes in the kind of different, complete opposite direction with this. And people are like, what are you doing? Are you sure you can do this? Do you know? And also he's also like a very introverted sort of man himself. And he freely admits that he's not the kind of person who loves taking charge as a director, and said that part of the process of directing this film was like excruciating for him. So I can definitely see where there would be some people around him being like, are you sure? And he just goes with it all the way.
Yeah, no, definitely. But it's such even though he's not the strongest director, and he's not even a strong writer. Like, his dialogue isn't good. He's
Yeah.
a really strong world builder. And the fact that he just really believed, and he found people that would believe in what he wanted to do, that's great. So many people would have just said, "No, maybe I should just put this away and not, not do this. Maybe I should work on other things." But he didn't. And then, when Star Wars was such a huge hit, he still wanted to make the movie he wanted to make. So he ended up mostly financing Empire Strikes Back on his own because he didn't want the studio to have all this control.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think that that's a great thing about what he did. Like, he really wanted to keep that creative control. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, but
Right.
mostly good.
Yeah. And I just want to talk some about the story itself and how it really is like the classic hero's journey and has essentially become like a template for a lot of screenwriters who want to make especially blockbuster movies of this nature. To like this is kind of a winning formula, basically. Like, this is how you capture an audience. And like, from the beginning, obviously we have Luke, who's this ordinary guy, kind of an obscure guy, very outside the world of what's actually happening out in space and everything, and really just like finds his destiny and everything to do with the Force and kind of trusting your instincts is really great, I think. And all of the characters around him are just like instantly memorable and distinct in a way that I find really fascinating, especially compared to so many other sci-fi films where they really do not have that instant, like, yes, like attachment, like instantly iconic. And it comes down to the looks of them. It comes down to the performances. And I just think from a story level, it might not be one of the most original arcs in the world by any means. But I think the way that he is able to sort of take from a lot of different influences and just create a pure, entertaining experience is fantastic.
The Hidden Fortress being a big one.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think one of the things that really works with the story is that he takes his time. And there's so many people have a tendency to just want to rush right in, and they expect you to care about these characters within the first 10 minutes of the movie, but they haven't really given you enough of a reason to. And in this, he doesn't necessarily expect you to just totally care or know who you're supposed to even be rooting for in the first few minutes. Obviously, you're supposed to be against Darth Vader and afraid of him. That's very clear right off the bat. I mean,
right, especially with the music as well.
Yeah, and he's basically the first character that you actually come across and see. And he's just that entrance. Can we talk about that for a second? Because I love that entrance. That just, it's so foreboding and so powerful. And
I know.
Like, as a child, I was like terrified every time. Like, oh
yeah,
my gosh,
I could see why, for sure.
Vader. Yeah. But then you meet Princess Leia, and she's this smartass, but
so plucky. Yeah.
Yes, she's great, and you're just like, wow, this girl's awesome. She's standing up to the bad guy, but you still don't really know like what's going on or
dynamics,
why.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, or why you're supposed to be rooting for her, but they don't. She gets taken hostage, but she's not like in any sort of such imminent threat that you have to be worrying about her right in that moment. Yeah. You're just getting to know her, and it's those kinds of things. And when you meet Luke, you know there's this buildup as you're getting to know him, and then Han Solo as well. And so he doesn't just jump in and expect you to just fill in the gaps yourself. Like, he gives you the information you need to know about these people when you need to know it.
Right.
And I think a big part of that is because he knew he hoped he was going to have time, a couple of films to accomplish this. And so he didn't just rush right in.
Right. And I'm so glad you did mention that beginning, because I found it so interesting that, like, after that particular scene you were talking about, like, most of the beginning is just kind of following these two robots, basically. And Luke doesn't really even show up to like 20 minutes in or something like that, which is kind of an interesting storytelling tactic, because I think it is a very natural way of, I mean, I feel like it's kind of a kid-friendly thing to have like these two bickering robots walking through the desert. And then, you know, to have Luke obviously discover them and everything. I feel like it's all told very naturally.
Yeah, and you don't even meet Han Solo until another 10 or 15 minutes after that.
Right, right.
Yeah, and it's just, and that's, I think, one of the things that's smart about having actors who at that point were mostly unknown. I mean, Harrison Ford had done American Graffiti, and Carrie Fisher was, you know, she'd done Shampoo, and she was, you know, the daughter of Debbie Reynolds.
Right.
So I mean, everyone knew who she was. There were a lot of expectations, but they weren't big movie stars. They didn't have big acting pedigrees, so you don't really know who you're going to meet or when. And so it doesn't. There's not this like, oh, where's Harrison Ford? Why hasn't he shown up yet? You know, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, now who's this guy?
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that's exactly why so many people just kind of identify them with their characters just forever, no matter what they would do for the rest of their careers. It's just like, well, especially in the case of Carrie Fisher, like she is Princess Leia. And
I love that at a certain point she embraced that.
Yeah.
Like I read her last memoir, Princess Diarist, and I love how she was just like, you know, yeah, I mean, I'm not her, but I am, and it's fine. And I think at some point you have to either completely separate yourself from that, or you have to fully embrace it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Harrison Ford ever really did.
Yeah, well, he certainly has Indiana Jones and other roles that he would come to be known for, of course, but
yes.
Yeah, but he's fantastic. They're all fantastic, I think. I just wanted to mention that, like, I love this film. I'll say that. But I think it's interesting that for me, the beginning and the middle are a lot more engaging for me, and I think are better than how it ends necessarily. Because I think some of the ending where it's a lot of it is obviously dedicated to figuring out how to destroy the Death Star. And that very long sequence of them, you know, going over and over trying to get the external exhaust port thing and everything like that. I think some of that is not as engaging for me for whatever reason, at least on this watch from this past week, just compared to kind of the fun and the interesting dynamics that's happening between the people in the beginning and the middle. But I think the Star Wars universe has stronger endings. I'll say that. Like, obviously, Empire Strikes Back and Last Jedi even.
But if you think about what they're doing in that ending, that entire battle sequence of the Death Star, that had never been done before.
That is true.
I mean, that entire thing was visual effects. And, you know, and there have been a lot of movies where there's, you know, dogfights and stuff with planes, but there's never been anything like this where, I mean, they make it look, it's pretty convincing. At least it was. My copy with the theatrical version, actually you can see the boxes around all the TIE fighters and everything. Oh. So you can see where they kind of digitally inserted them, but so it's pretty funny. But it's just one of those charms of watching the movie 40 years later. But,
right.
But yeah, no, I think that's part of why that scene is actually so great, is because of the production value of it and because of the visual effects that are involved. On a story perspective, you're probably right. It's definitely not as strong as some of the other endings, but I think that what it is really doing is so impressive. And it's also a really fun battle, you know, and when Luke has to decide to trust in the Force and trust in himself and not use the guidance system that everyone else is trying to use unsuccessfully.
Right.
And then you've got
turns off his thing, yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got Han Solo who shows up out of nowhere and proves that, like, okay, maybe I don't suck so much, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, the special effects, I mean, yeah, it's, when you look at it today, it's like, okay, this is another battle sequence, visual effects heavy thing, but we should definitely certainly mention that this was very revolutionary and innovative. So yeah, I've not on that level. Of course, it's like dazzling, especially for 1977. I mean, I don't have the theatrical version on Blu-ray. I have the special edition thing where there's things inserted from George Lucas, but so I don't know like exactly if that is the same as the theatrical version. But
The scene plays out the same. It's just
yeah,
the look of it
visually, right,
is much more polished now.
right,
But
right.
yeah, one thing I will say about the ending though is that I think that if this movie were made now, Princess Leia, who we know became General Leia,
Hmm.
or General Organa, um, she just is so she is relegated to this very passive role during that entire fight. Like she's just sitting there kind of watching everything that's happening while other people are calling the shots. She's not out there fighting. Not that she ever would because she wasn't a pilot. But it's just interesting because in later films she would end up being that one that's calling those shots and making those decisions. Um, so that's if I could change one thing about that that last act, I guess it would be to just make her more involved in that battle.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think she is one of the most interesting characters. I just, every time she's on screen, I'm just so drawn into what she's doing. So,
Mm-hmm. And well,
um,
she's such a big part of why that battle was even able to happen in the first
exactly.
place.
Like I said, she kind of kickstarts this whole adventure. So, yeah. I was reading old reviews of Star Wars from 77, and a troubling amount of them actually, like most of them mention the figure of Carrie Fisher
Yeah,
and about how like how cute she is, the princess that needs to be saved and all this sorts of things and like very professional things like Newsweek and Time and things like this. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't know if that's exactly the main takeaway we should have from this entire film because she's like
exactly. Well,
a very
especially
dynamic
because
character, you know.
she really is, and well, that's the thing. It's like okay, on a very technical sense, she has to be rescued. She can't get out of there herself.
Yeah,
But once they open the door for her, she's running things. She's the one that gets them where they need to go. She's the one, she so much of their being able to escape is because of her,
right.
and so she's not just a damsel in distress. She knows how to take care of herself.
Yeah. And finally, we should definitely mention the score by John Williams, which, I mean, I've said a lot of hyperbolic things on this show, but is probably the most iconic film score of all time? Question mark?
Yes,
Yeah,
I would say it is.
yeah,
I know there are some people that would disagree, but I absolutely say it is. I mean, this is one that even if you've never seen it, you know what it's from.
right.
And people all over the world recognize it instantly. Like just those first few notes, not even measures, those first few notes, you know what it is. And it's gorgeous music too. It's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of classic film scores, Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia, and there's a lot. Psycho,
Yeah.
but nothing. I don't think anything really drew people into what a film score could do,
Hmm.
quite like John Williams with this one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's not just the main introductory theme, it's a lot of the themes, especially like even one that might not be talked about as much, although it's still people love it, is like the Luke theme
Mhm.
that plays when he's kind of looking out at the moons on his planet. Is just beautiful and kind of gives me chills every time. I'd like
Yeah.
even down to
Which,
like the
by the way, fun fact: in Tunisia, there is a spot where they filmed that, where you actually do see that reflecting the reflection of the two suns as
wow,
it's setting. So that wasn't even a special effect.
there you go. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And even down to like the Cantina band stuff is just so like
It's
goofy, but
great.
also it weirdly works and is catchy. So I
So
kind of love it.
catchy. Once I
Yeah,
hear it, I can't get it out of my head.
exactly. So it's great on a practical level. Just changed the game. It was so influential. On a story level, even though it might, like we said, might not be like the best it still, I think, provided such a great template for what a movie like this could do. So it was really, more or less, regardless of what happens at the Oscars, the defining movie of 1977. And we could certainly debate whether, yeah.
Yeah, I would say it was the defining movie of probably the next 20 years at least.
Well, right, yeah.
Yeah.
And, we'll
and
certainly...
It's one of those, it's sorry, I just cut you off, but
it's
one of those that it's funny because it's hard to talk about from a critical standpoint because of the fact that it's so ingrained in our pop culture. It's a thing that everyone knows and either loves or doesn't. But everyone has an opinion on it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Some are much louder than others.
Yes.
And also it's one that, like I said, it's the first movie I ever actually saw. Literally and sort of not literally. And so it's hard to fully just be able to look at it as a film by itself and be completely fair in judging it, because there's so much in it that is nostalgic and iconic, and it's a great film. It's just, I love that it exists, and I love that it's created this entire universe, that there's just so much involved in that whole world. And all started with this silly little film that nobody wanted to make.
There you have it. Yeah, there's so much, there's a wealth of story that you can take just from this one film. Obviously, they have done that with the movies and TV show and all sorts of things. So it's iconic. Everyone has seen it, more or less. Some people like to boast about how I've never seen a Star Wars film. We've seen certainly some of that on the internet, of course. But, even as someone like me who might not love action, sci-fi types of things as much as other films, it's the best. It's pretty much the best of its kind, I think. So, what else is there to say? It's Star Wars. It's Star Wars.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when we come back, we will be talking about why Star Wars lost Best Picture to a little movie called Annie Hall.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming in too fast!
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2.
Hello.
No sauces, no sauces!
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
And we're back. So now we will be discussing why Star Wars lost Best Picture to Annie Hall, a very different movie. And so Star Wars was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for George Lucas, Best Supporting Actor for Alec Guinness, Best Original Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Film Editing, Best Original Score, Best Sound, Best Visual Effects, and it also received a Special Achievement Award for Ben Burt for the creation of the alien, creature, and robot voices. And it also won 6 of those competitive Oscars, including art direction, costume design, film editing, original score, sound, and visual effects. And before the Oscars, Star Wars actually won the Los Angeles Film Critics Best Picture Prize, which is kind of great. And Annie Hall actually won the DGA, the BAFTA, and the WGA. But generally speaking, like The Turning Point and The Goodbye Girl and even Julia were films that sort of did well in the precursors as well. But Annie Hall is the film that emerges as the best picture. So why do we think Annie Hall did this and beat Star Wars?
Oh man. So my unpopular opinion is that I don't actually love Annie Hall.
How dare you?
I know. I think it's fine, but I don't really love it. But I think the reason that it won is because, in 1977, Star Wars was considered, that silly kid space movie. And that was for most people, that was just going to be impossible to overcome. And so then they see this other film that is witty and it's got a lot of social commentary, and it's Woody Allen, who a lot of people still really liked at the time, and it was easy to choose that. It was easy to root for that one.
Yeah. And this was after he had done a lot of his kind of more broad comedies. Mm-hmm. And even though Annie Hall is considered a comedy and certainly has a lot of funny moments, and wins best comedy actually it doesn't win at Golden Globes, but regardless, it was known as one of the few comedy films to win best picture. Basically, it is also still considered at that time his more dramatic, serious work. So
yeah, it was kind of a turning point for him, actually. I think if you look at his filmography, I think that's where he started to look more on a deeper level at people, and not just at situations, but at character. I think my problem with Annie Hall is that so much of that analysis or that reflection was just about himself, so it feels like just a big therapy session for Woody Allen that I didn't necessarily need to watch.
And it's with Diane Keaton, who I believe he was in a relationship with.
Yeah, and I mean, she's impossible not to like, but she's playing that. It wasn't called this, until much later, but her character is very much in the realm of the manic pixie dream world. And it's there are some really good things about her character, but overall, it's just kind of drives me nuts.
That's very understandable. But it's interesting looking at this entire field of 5, because I feel like Star Wars certainly was not the kind of film that had any real chance of winning a Best Picture, based on the fact that pretty much no films like this had ever been nominated for Best Picture. The closest you might even come is as far as sci-fi is, I guess, A Clockwork Orange, but also that's not really quite the same thing.
Not at all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But the reason why I should mention this now is the reason why I'm choosing Star Wars as the runner-up here compared to maybe Julia or The Turning Point, which both get 11 nominations, is, first of all, by process of elimination, I think The Turning Point didn't have enough passion because it won nothing. And so there's that. And as far as Julia, looking at the film, despite the fact that it wins 3 major Oscars, which is adapted screenplay and 2 supporting performances, I just don't know if, based on watching the film, if that was going to be the kind of movie that they would embrace as a Best Picture, because also it didn't really win any Best Picture prizes. So it's kind of I don't know if it was ever considered that type of a contender. Whereas Star Wars, I think, obviously, we talk about how you need to have broad support with the technical branches to maybe win Best Picture, and Star Wars pretty much swept the technical branches, and it was unlike anything anyone had seen.
Oh yeah. And that's the thing, is that if you look at the films of 1977, there are only a couple that really even stand out and have endured.
Mm.
Even just in that Best Picture lineup, only Annie Hall and Star Wars are movies that people really even still talk about.
Yeah.
Occasionally people will remember The Goodbye Girl, but that's usually when they're just doing a Richard Dreyfuss retrospective.
Right.
You know, and so it's like these aren't movies that people even really think about anymore. You never watch them. You can't even find the turning point anywhere.
I know.
And you tried, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And so it's like, it almost feels like those other 3 nominations, even though, yes, they got a lot of other nominations, it almost feels like they were just filling out the category.
Right. The
Not
sense
even
I got,
honest, it feels like they were filling out the category.
yeah, the sense I got even from like the acting categories even is that they were really kind of struggling to find contenders, because I'll certainly get to this later, but some of them are a little bit questionable, especially with Julia and the Turning Point. So yeah, I think Annie Hall, it managed to also comment on the times in a way between the, relationships between men and women and how they change, and looking back on a past relationship, trying to figure out what went wrong. Diane Keaton had her fashion, so that in some ways crossed over into like mainstream fashion and things like that. So it had certain elements to it that made it more distinct compared to the others. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it emerged.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I mean, it does have that really witty dialogue too in a lot of places. So.
Right.
I can understand. I mean, it's an easy movie to like.
Yeah. Also, it's a cool 90 minutes. So yeah, it's an easy watch.
This came out way before anybody had ever heard anything negative about Woody Allen. So
right.
There's that.
There is that. So let's just go through a few questions we got in regard to Annie Hall and Star Wars, which this is from Gordon at Mark Wahlberg, who said, what do you think ultimately got in the way of Woody Allen not winning Best Actor here? Parentheses, all opinions of him aside, close parentheses. and could it have something to do with the fact that Cuckoo's Nest had just pulled the Big Five sweep 2 years prior?
That's a good question. I actually think the biggest thing that got in the way was Woody Allen.
Himself.
Yeah, because he's playing himself.
Yeah.
That character is him. And I think that people looking at that, they see that as, it's not so much of a performance as just it's his persona.
Yeah. Like you said, kind of a therapy session. He's just like venting all of his feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I just don't know if he was going to be seen as like the actor. I don't know that anyone really feels like Woody Allen is a great actor who needs to win a Best Actor prize so much.
No.
So,
but you also have the fact that Richard Dreyfuss had 2 big movie roles that year. And
yes.
So I think that it was easy to reward him for one of them.
Right. So Richard Dreyfuss, he wins for The Goodbye Girl. And at the same time, pretty much, he has the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So huge year for Richard Dreyfuss. And we often see that kind of a thing happen at the Oscars, where someone has a really big year and that really kind of helps propel them to be like, okay, this was your year, Richard Dreyfuss. Here you go.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also we got a question, 2 kind of on the same track, which is one from Cameron McRae, who said, given the current trend to give Best Director to the big technical film, do you think George Lucas would have won if this race was held today?
So if it was the exact same race, I actually think Spielberg might have gotten in there.
Ooh.
And I think that there might have been more of a competition between Close Encounters and Star Wars.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that, Star Wars is amazing and it did a lot of great things. But I think that when you look at Close Encounters, it's got this really interesting family drama aspect of it too. And, this government side story. And there's just so many other things that are happening there that make it just an even deeper story than what you get with Star Wars.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think that it would have gotten a lot more attention.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think obviously in a field where we can have more than 5 Best Picture nominees, Close Encounters would certainly be in that lineup because it's received 8 nominations. So yeah, that would be kind of ridiculous if it hadn't gotten into Best Picture. And also we already talked about how like they were kind of barely even finding enough people to fill the categories here. So I think they definitely would have welcomed that. I guess if this were the case, I definitely think Woody Allen would not have won Best Director. Just aside from the personal aspect of him, it's just, I agree that the technical sort of films definitely have been winning lately, especially this decade. So probably George Lucas.
I think it's because people are seeing that how much work that is to bring all those elements together. And now that we see more and more of these big technical movies, this is one thing. Damien Chazelle, for example, I'm not a fan of his stories, but you can't deny that his technical work is amazing, and he knows how to blend together those elements of cinematography and production design, and in the case of First Man, for example, the visual effects and the sound and all that. And that's something that not a lot of directors can do that well.
Yeah.
And so to pull that together for Star Wars, I think that that's definitely something that would be recognized more today.
Yeah, I agree. This is actually from Jeffrey Kerr, who asked, if you were to still give Annie Hall Best Picture, would you have also given Best Director to Woody Allen, or would you have gone for a split by giving it to George Lucas for Star Wars?
Absolutely a split.
Yeah.
But going back to what I said before, I actually would be torn between Lucas and Spielberg.
Yeah, that's tough. It's because those
definitely wouldn't be Woody.
Definitely not Woody. But we'll certainly get to this a little later. But as far as Annie Hall as a Best Picture, I wonder if you would even vote for that when we also have Star Wars here,
Myself personally, no.
Right. Yeah, it's
sorry, spoiler alert.
That's fine. It's a little closer for me, but that would definitely be the easiest way of rewarding both films, is to just do it that way.
Yeah, it would make more sense to do it that way, I think, than the other way.
Oh yeah.
Allen and then Star Wars.
Yeah, for sure. Another question from Daniel B. at Raven Orioles 21 said, in your opinion, do you believe that The Empire Strikes Back should have received a similar amount of awards attention to the original Star Wars, and which one do you prefer? Well, we already know which one you prefer.
Yes, and actually, I would say that it should have received a similar and maybe a higher number of Oscar nominations, because I think it should have gotten some more acting in there.
Yes.
I think that Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher in particular were very strong, and I would love to have seen them get nominated.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was definitely a bit of a sequel bias sort of thing that happened there, where it wasn't even considered too innovative anymore. It wasn't this big discovery anymore. It was still Star Wars Nation, and then the sequel comes around. Some of it feels like it's more of the same. They don't know if they want to reward that again, but it did still do somewhat well with technicals. But
and people who weren't fans before aren't going to be fans of this one.
Right, certainly not. Yeah. So let's get to some of these other films in the race. As we mentioned, The Goodbye Girl, The Turning Point, and Julia. The Turning Point, we should note, is not available anywhere to stream. But
it's like it's stopped existing.
Yes, it's just lost to time. But also not really, because I did manage to watch the film, and I won't reveal how, but I did. Let's just say that.
Okay.
Yeah. So have you seen some of these, all of these?
I've seen The Goodbye Girl, but it's been a long time.
Yeah.
And that's one of those, I really wanted to try to watch it again before we did this episode, but I just ran out of time to do it. So it's been a while. Julia, I think I've seen it, but I don't remember. So I guess that counts as not seeing it.
Half, yeah. Well, like we said, Julia and The Turning Point end up leading the nominations with 11 each. Julia wins supporting actor for Jason Robards. This was his second in a row after All the President's Men. And supporting actress for Vanessa Redgrave, who was in the titular role of Julia. And it won adapted screenplay as well. So clearly did pretty well. It is about a quote unquote important subject matter, since it has the backdrop of Nazis and it's about kind of international implications of things. It's about this relationship, this friendship between Lillian Herman, played by Jane Fonda, and her friend Vanessa Redgrave, Julia, who is kind of a radical person who gets really into, international matters and wanting to fight for people's freedom and things like that. And it's about their evolving relationship over time. I think it has some undercurrents of some queer elements that are explored in one scene, but then kind of dropped, which, I mean, it's 77, so it is what it is. But really interesting kind of dual female energy that's happening in this film that I found very engaging. I definitely wouldn't put it up there with Annie Hall and Star Wars by any means, but I think it's a film that deserves a revisit because I think it's interesting. It has good performances. It has an interesting story, even though some of it's a little bit disjointed, where the beginning kind of feels like a thriller, and then the second half is kind of more traditional, and the ending is weird. So, I mean, it's a little all over the place, but I think it's very engaging on a filmmaking level, at least. And there's a reason it kind of bears out with 11 nominations here. I will say the Jason Robards win makes zero sense to me because he is just kind of there to provide wisdom to Jane Fonda. And it's like, okay, it's a lot of it is just him being like a sounding board for her and her journey. And he's like, I'm just going to give you advice for 10 minutes and then I'm done. So it's
my favorite kind of supporting character. Yeah.
Yes. It's a very odd win, but I guess it can be explained by the fact that the competition is very weak overall. Yeah. So I don't know. Like, a lot of people had questions about Jason Robards on Twitter. Like, I got this from 3 different people asking how Jason Robards won. And one of them, Ronnie Castle, was very worked up about this supporting actor race, who said, why did they give Jason Robards the win after already having won one last year? Alec Guinness should have won. Also, Mikhail Baryshnikov gives the worst performance to ever be nominated. So, yeah. Weak category.
I do agree that Alec Guinness should have won.
Yeah, I kind of do too. Like, it's not a huge acting showcase as much, but I think he provides such a fascinating anchor element to the film that's needed.
Yeah. Well, he has this very quiet dignity about him, where there's so much that he doesn't have to say because he's able to communicate it just with a look, or just in the way that he reacts to things. And it's one of those things that really frustrates me, because so many of these, it's funny when people call them genre, because I'm sorry, drama is a genre too, but but when people ignore genre roles and performances in horror films and in comedies and in in sci-fi and fantasy as being somehow lesser, but I think it takes every bit as much ability and talent and skill to be able to portray those characters. And I think that Alec Guinness did such a great job in this sort of this mentor role, but he also gets to be a little bit of a hero, at one point. And it's just such a fun character. And I love that he just embraced it,
Yeah.
I mean, he's this guy that has been in Hollywood for years. He's been acting for years. And he's just like, yeah, sure.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Guy, that's cool.
Yeah, and he had already won an Oscar, of course, for Bridge on the River Kwai.
Yes.
I mean, he's been in Lawrence of Arabia, David Lean films. So I think that was part of why he was even nominated to begin with, is that he was a very well-known person, especially in this field. But also, like, looking at the competition, I'm like, what is Alec Guinness not doing that Jason Robards is doing that would make people vote for Jason Robards, especially after literally giving it to him the previous year? It just doesn't really add up to me.
It's one of those things where you feel like they kind of maybe just wanted to reward the movie somewhere.
Yeah.
So they give it to Jason Robards because he was the best known. Maybe, I don't know. At least between the two actors from that movie that were nominated. So.
Yeah, and maybe a predominant acting academy might not be as tuned into a movie like Star Wars compared to some of the technical branches, you know. So we've certainly seen that nowadays, where there's been like this anxiety with actors, like, are our jobs going to be at risk because everyone can just do everything in a computer now? They can take our faces and just do whatever they want. So
luckily that costs a whole lot of money, and it's cheaper to still to pay people.
Right. For now it's good.
For
now. So the turning point is an interesting one. This is another one about that center on two women. And it's interesting that, you know, the two films that do the best this year happen to revolve around female relationships, which we don't often see. And the two of them, Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine, are both nominated in Best Actress, which is a rarity, as we know. But it's about this ballerina who, Anne Bancroft, who has been working in the field for several years. And then we have this other one played by Shirley MacLaine, who left because she got married, got pregnant, had kids, just left it all behind. She goes back, and kind of all of the old feelings of like resentment, but also bonding friendship, everything kind of comes back to the surface again when they reunite. So interesting film. I have to admit, it's not one of my favorites. It's very, very old fashioned and a little bit soapy in a way that just doesn't really work now. It's very like soft focus and things like that in a way that make it feel very old fashioned. But still great performances from Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine. And I think, you know, it's almost similar what Shirley MacLaine does in this movie that she does in Terms of Endearment. And has the similar sort of female relationship and her having these complicated feelings towards the other person. But she emotes so much in the film that I feel like if there was anyone who was going to win outside of Diane Keaton, it would have been Shirley MacLaine. So I will agree a little bit with Ronnie Castle in saying that Mikhail Baryshnikov getting nominated here is kind of absurd, honestly. I think a lot of that is just he danced really well, and that was fun to watch.
Well, that's what he did.
Right. Yeah, because we should also mention that he was very well known as a ballet dancer before this, and so it's kind of a first big film role for him, and he freely admitted that like this was not his strong suit, acting. So it's interesting that he gets a nomination for it. And again, I think it kind of speaks to the field in that particular year and whatever it was the Oscars were at least focusing on. I'm sure there were great performances outside of that, but yeah, I think he just happened to be in the right movie that the Academy embraced, and he just went along for the ride.
Yeah, it's just a weird film year. You know, you look at other stuff that came out that year, and it's like, I don't even know what I would have replaced him with.
Yeah, it's tough.
You know?
Yeah, I don't know. Interesting film. Very interesting. And I feel bad, like, feeling, like, awkward and not great about Julia or The Turning Point because, you know, I feel like these are both very strong female-centric films that we don't often see in the Oscar race. But
especially in the 70s.
Right, exactly, especially in the 70s. And I just feel like they're not great, and that's kind of a bummer, especially looking at it now. But I don't know how it would have been at the time. Yeah, I just wanted to go quickly back to Julia because there was some interesting Oscar moments as far as the Oscar ceremony. And I don't know if you know about this in the Vanessa Redgrave of it all. But she was very outspoken about supporting the Palestinians.
Yes, that's right.
And the Jewish Defense League was very opposed to Julia, the film, and even like called in bomb threats to screenings of the film, and were very militant about just making sure no one can see this movie, basically protesting, boycotting everything because of her involvement specifically. And she ends up winning an Oscar for it. Also, there's protests outside the Oscar ceremony at the time, so very relevant. And she makes a speech when she wins Best Supporting Actress that is very political. And I will say that it's interesting when people talk about how, like, hey, let's go back to the time when the Oscars weren't about all these political statements and all this stuff. Why can't it just be about the movies? Well, in the 70s, and especially in this case, like, it was pretty rampant.
Oh yeah.
So I
there
feel
were a lot of times political statements were a big part of the ceremony. So.
Right. So it's just people kind of looking back with rose-colored glasses, being like, remember when it wasn't about politics? Come on, guys. Yeah. But I just want to read a quick excerpt from her speech. She says, and I salute you and I pay tribute to you, and I think you should be very proud that in the last few weeks you've stood firm and have refused to be intimidated by the threats of a small bunch of Zionist hoodlums whose behavior is an insult to the stature of Jews all over the world and their great and heroic record of struggle against fascism and oppression. And I salute that record, and I salute all of you for having stood firm and dealt a final blow against that period when Nixon and McCarthy launched a worldwide witch hunt against those who tried to express in their lives and their work the truth that they believed in. And this was all off the cuff. This was not just like her reading a speech. This was her very confidently saying these things. And there were people booing. Some people were applauding, but a lot of boos. So that happened.
It's funny that people would vocally express their disagreement, their dissent. Because now it's like most of the time if someone says something, like on a big show like the Oscars, you know, people will just kind of sit there and not respond.
Right.
So let's go back to those days.
I know. Let's just get right in there. Like, express ourselves. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. And it doesn't just end there. It's later in the ceremony, we have Patty Chayefsky, the writer of Network, making a statement of his own because he presents the writing awards and he says, there's a little matter I'd like to tidy up, at least if I expect to live with myself tomorrow morning. I would like to say, personal opinion, of course, that I'm sick and tired of people exploiting the Academy Awards for the propagation of their own personal propaganda. I would like to suggest to Miss Redgrave that her winning an Academy Award is not a pivotal moment in history, does not require a proclamation, and a simple thank you would have sufficed. So there was drama all around at this ceremony.
Oh man, so this is also in the days when people would publicly call people out, not on Twitter.
I know. Well, they had no other option, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
So that's that. It's quite interesting, like imagining that kind of a thing happening nowadays, because it's very, you know, everyone's very careful of their image, and if they do call people out, it would be on Twitter, like you said. But here it's just like everyone's just out in the open, and that's really kind of what the 70s were all about at the Oscars, especially when you have, obviously, Marlon Brando, that whole thing with The Godfather. It was everywhere, and people were protesting the Academy Awards all over the place in the 70s. And so, yeah, it's just a very different period of time.
Yeah, because now people just don't watch them if they're mad.
Well, that is true, sadly. Yeah, don't really have anything to say to that. It's true.
And tweet about how great they are for not watching it. That's also a thing.
Yes, very performative, being like, well, I don't care about these Academy Awards.
I'm going to take my time to tell you how little I care about the thing you care about.
Yes, and how you should feel bad for caring about it.
Yes.
Oh, God. Yeah. Just the quick questions I want to run through from Andrew Carden, who said, did The Turning Point, which went 0 for 11, deserve a triumph on any of its nominations? Well, I looked at all these nominations, and I feel really bad saying this, but I don't think it should have won anything. Like, there's just so many different races here where a film like Star Wars is nominated against The Turning Point, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to say The Turning Point has better sound than Star Wars. So, I mean,
well, it's like, without having seen Turning Point and not being able to have a, strong opinion on that, I would agree with you. Like, just looking at some of these things, I'm like, costume design. Oh no, it wasn't nominated for costume design. But yeah, like just some of these others, it's like, no, Star Wars definitely should win over that. And
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, Andrew. I'm sure you're a fan. But yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I wish that it was more available to people so they could see for themselves how it is, because I think obviously the performances are definitely worth it. But as a film, I just don't think it is deserving of being in this lineup, sadly. Yeah. But let's get to The Goodbye Girl. You said you've seen The Goodbye Girl, kind of.
Long time.
Yeah.
I remember it, but not super well.
Yeah. It's from Neil Simon, directed by Herbert Ross, who also directed The Turning Point. Good year for Herbert Ross. So The Goodbye Girl is kind of a classic kind of Neil Simon sort of, it feels like a play. There's lots of interactions between men and women. It's set in the world in theater. And yeah, kind of just about this misunderstanding that happens where this guy played by Richard Dreyfuss moves into this household where the father has left, and there's just the mother played by Marsha Mason and her daughter are there, and so they kind of have this odd couple sort of misunderstandings, but then they grow together and they grow to appreciate each other and of course start a relationship. So
You have to.
yes,
That's how these things work.
men and women living together, of course they're in a relationship.
Never
So
going to not turn into a relationship.
right. So I found it interesting that Quinn Cummings, who plays the little girl in the film, was nominated for supporting actress. And she's one of those like wisecracking, wise beyond her years types of girls in films who are just like very intelligent for some reason.
Yeah.
Because it's funny.
It is funny, but it's also like, yeah. I was one of those. I was wise beyond my years. But
Well. Yeah.
yeah, it's such a trope, and you see it so much especially in movies in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
I think it's very common, and yeah. So, it's something that gets noticed. I think that's how she managed to get an Oscar nomination for it, because it does catch your attention.
Yeah. Lots of wisecracks. And I think the chemistry between Richard Dreyfuss and Marsha Mason is very good. I think they're both excellent. It's interesting that Richard Dreyfuss does win, because it's not the kind of role that typically wins. It's just, it's like a lighter sort of romantic comedy type of role that doesn't necessarily have that huge dramatic weight to it. But he really brings that character to life as just kind of like this sensitive and also insecure, but also confident kind of a character to life. Well, I was reading like in Inside Oscar just about how he had become a bit of like an idol almost, as far as being like this alternative to like the rogue sort of super masculine tough guys, because he's like sensitive and he still has like a confidence to him. Like I said, like, he's like manly in a different way, that sort of thing. He's like the alternative choice.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is exactly why Woody Allen didn't win. I think that where Woody is this, neurotic, kind of bumbling guy. You've got Richard Dreyfuss there, who's in not a similar movie, but like the feeling of it, like watching it is, you get a little bit of a similar vibe.
Oh yeah.
And so I think that's where Richard Dreyfuss's character stands out, because he is more confident. He is more he's more of the type of guy that you want to root for.
Exactly. Yeah. By far. Yeah. So yeah, it's really an interesting lineup. Like I said, I really don't think the three movies here have necessarily stood the test of time by any means, but I would probably rank The Goodbye Girl as number 3. I think it still has a lot of fun, even some laugh out loud moments to it. And that's obviously from the clever Neil Simon screenplay. But I think
that's one that people. I think the reason it has not stood the test of time is just because it's not really ever playing anywhere. And so, I know it recently was on Amazon Prime, but I think that it's one that people just haven't had the opportunity to revisit, so it's kind of been lost to time. But it's one that I would definitely recommend checking out.
Yeah. And it's going to be a bummer going through towards the beginning of Oscars that I feel like this is just going to keep happening on a grander level. I'm just, not going to be able to find like a majority of the Best Picture nominees, for example. And so that just underscores a lot of, I think, what you've been talking about on Citizen Dame is like the preservation of classic cinema. Like, these are films that were nominated for Best Picture, had an impact, and it's just, you can't find them. If you were interested in them, you have to really go out of your way to try to find them, and that's sad.
It is, and it's the thing that I think people just go, well, I just don't like to watch old movies. That tends to be a constant refrain I hear from people. But this is part of our culture, and we're losing that culture because of the fact that we're not preserving these films, and because people are not studying them. They're not studying them because they're not available. But we're losing our personal history. We're losing our film history, and every day I'm so sad that Filmstruck is gone, because the curation that they had and the way that they would not only, because this is an important part of it, it wasn't just like making these films available, but it was also bringing in all these conversations about them so that you could understand what the history was at that time that movie came out, and so it's like right now we're talking about Annie Hall and Star Wars. It's like, but part of that conversation needs to involve what the world was like in 1977 and where we were as a country, where we were culturally, and those are the kinds of conversations that are being lost when you especially get back into the 30s and 40s in film history.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. So we can kind of do a good transition here to talk about some of these other films that came out in 1977. By doing our Should Have Been a Contender segment. Thank you for beautifully teeing that up. So these are other films nominated for Oscars, but not Best Picture, or just any movie that came out in 77 that deserves attention. So Karen, let's talk Close Encounters.
Let's talk Close Encounters.
Right? Yeah.
I love Close Encounters. Yeah, I love it so much. It's, I remember when I was young, I was probably 9 or 10, and we went down to the video store to rent a movie, and my mom really wanted us to get Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I remember asking her, but what about the first and second kind? Like, I thought it was the third part of the trilogy.
We gotta see the first two first. Come on.
Exactly. This isn't gonna make any sense. I remember even just from at 9 or 10, however old I was, I remember just really loving the film. I've always had a problem with the ending. I don't love the decision that he makes in the end.
Right.
For very specific reasons. But I love the journey to get there. And I also, as an adult now, and understanding family dynamics, understanding that character and the way that he is developed throughout the course of the movie, and understanding what was going on in Spielberg's own personal life, that ending makes a lot more sense to me. I still don't love it, but I understand it, and I buy it. And but the movie itself, it's interesting, it's fun, it's got a lot to say about those family dynamics um, and about becoming obsessed with something like you need to get to answers and you just don't know where to look for them and you can't make anybody else understand what it is that you're seeking. I love the movie. I think that the special effects have not held up as well as Star Wars, um, which is interesting, but it's still fun. And you also have another really iconic score.
Oh, yeah.
um,
Also by
from
John Williams. Yep.
and then just Melinda Dillon and Richard Dreyfuss and Terry Garr are all so good.
Oh, yeah.
Great performances from them. And then you've also got an appearance by Francois Truffaut.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is fun to see him in there. So yeah, I think that it definitely, if this was if we had an expanded lineup, it would have been in, and it definitely should have been part of the conversation. And the fact that it gets in for director but not for picture is interesting to me, considering some of the other films that got in. Well, because there was something that got in for picture but not director. Was that The Goodbye Girl?
Yeah, it was The Goodbye Girl. And I think that's because Herbert Ross was nominated for The Turning Point. And I was reading that it was not able to have two, basically.
Right. They used to have that role. And it's just funny that that's the direction that they went.
Yeah.
Point instead of Goodbye Girl. But yeah.
Yeah. It's Close Encounters is a really interesting the fact that Star Wars also comes out in the same year as Close Encounters, it's almost like they sort of counterbalance each other in a way. They both have obviously the sci-fi element, but also just about the relationships between people. I think that's something that's underappreciated about Close Encounters, because obviously there's the alien elements and the obsession stuff, but just like you said, kind of the dynamics, especially between Richard Dreyfuss and his family, and his connection with the why did I just blank on her name? Melinda Dillon character. It's really interesting. The kid is kind of great. I think it's just a really well thought out movie, and I watched it watching it now. I saw how something like Arrival took some inspiration from Close Encounters, just as far as communicating with another species and becoming obsessed with it and not trying to kill it, just trying to understand it and figure out its ways and see if we can come to some sort of understanding, that sort of thing. And the ending did, it does, I think it affects me, certainly, just all the emotion of just the aliens actually coming down and greeting everyone and them picking out Richard Dreyfuss. I think it's a knockout ending.
Yeah. I mean, my personal feeling on it is just as a kid, a child of divorce, it sucks that he would just disappear and his family would never know what happened to him.
Right. There is that.
And that he would just make that decision that what he had been seeking and now has found becomes more important than everything else, including his children.
Right.
And that really bothered me forever.
That's fair. Yeah.
Me. But now, like I said, I understand it because it doesn't. It actually fits the journey that he takes. It fits the character.
Right.
As much as I don't want that to be what he does, it totally fits.
Right. And I think that's why it really connected to me. And that's something reflecting on the film and as the end credits come up, I'm just well, didn't he just abandon his entire family without really even telling them? Okay. She was just I'm taking my kids to my sisters, and that's the last we see of them. And then, he just goes off and makes the decision on his own, doesn't consult with anyone, is just I'm going to go live with the aliens for a while. See ya.
This is where he's led, and
right.
He's just going
to... Yeah. So, it receives 8 nominations. It wins for cinematography, which is such a great win, I must say. It's such a visually striking film.
Especially that scene in the truck alone at the railroad crossing is just so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
It is, yeah. And it's almost a shame that Star Wars comes out in the same year as Close Encounters, because I feel like Close Encounters easily could have swept a lot of these technicals as well, like sound especially, and visual effects maybe. So
Yeah, and even score in a different year would have probably won score.
Yeah, film editing, so it's interesting. And it's, I believe, in second place as far as films that were not nominated for Best Picture, but received the most nominations, which is 8. And the first is obviously They Shoot Horses, Don't They? It's tied with other films like Dreamgirls and Ragtime and things like that for 8. So, yeah.
It should have been nominated for Best Picture. It's
absolutely. Other movies that you might have?
It's such an interesting year. This isn't necessarily a movie I would have nominated, but I think in an expanded lineup, probably you would have seen Saturday Night Fever in there.
Sure.
I mean, it gets a Best Actor nomination.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, actually, just to go quickly on that, we did get a question about why the music of Saturday Night Fever was ignored. This is from Milstead on Movies, who said, should Saturday Night Fever have been recognized in the original song category?
Was that an original song, though?
Yes, it was. Yes. Staying Alive was original for the movie, written for the movie.
I don't know then, yeah. That's interesting. Just looking at what else was nominated, I mean, it's mostly Disney movies, so I guess.
Yeah, Candle on the Water from Pete's Dragon. Nobody Does It Better from The Spy Who Loved Me, which is great.
That's a great song.
Right? Yeah. The Slipper and the Rose Waltz. He Danced With Me, She Danced With Me from The Slipper and the Rose, the story of Cinderella.
Oh my gosh.
Someone's Waiting for You from The Rescuers, and You Light Up My Life from You Light Up My Life, which was a huge hit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say Staying Alive absolutely should have been nominated. It's an iconic song and fits with the film very well. So I am kind of baffled that it was not nominated.
That's interesting. I just had always assumed that it was not written specifically for the film, and that's why. But
yeah, well, I was reading in Inside Oscar that it didn't make the short list for original song, and the studio was protesting it. Yeah, the studio was contesting it to be this obviously deserves to be in here. How does it not even make the short list, let alone nominated? So yeah, it just didn't work. Yeah. There's something about it. Maybe it's BG, popular music bias. I don't know.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, certainly another movie from 77 that people do remember. We can say that. So.
Okay. Yeah, that used to be on PTLA Channel 5 on Saturday afternoons all the time when I was a kid.
There you go. Yeah.
It's just such an interesting year, though. I think it would have been one where there probably would have only been 6 or 7 nominees in an expanded category if they didn't have to go to 10.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I don't even know what else might have gotten in there. Maybe Oh God.
Maybe Oh God, yeah.
That might have. Was kind of that just goofy comedy nomination.
Yeah. I would say Equus probably was close.
Oh, yeah.
With Richard Burton. It certainly gets acting and writing and things like that. So
yeah, that definitely. Yeah, you're right.
And Richard Burton had a lot of heat for possibly getting a Best Actor win. Of course, it does not happen. This is from Kyle Bailey, who said, if Richard Burton went supporting for Equus, do you think he would have won? Probably, because that's a very bleak field.
Yeah, and you probably would have not seen Baryshnikov in there or something.
Probably not. Yeah, so that's very sad for Richard Burton. But I haven't seen Equus, so I can't really say for sure. It's also not available anywhere.
Yeah. Come back, Filmstruck.
Right? Save us. Save me in particular, because I'm trying to watch all these movies that haven't really been available. And yeah. A few movies I wanted to mention. One of them is Eraserhead. That's David Lynch, of course, our old pal David Lynch. So this was definitely a defining film for David Lynch. Very, very scary. Just outright terrifying in like that dread way that he does so well. And is basically a film that is one of the best sort of modes to be like birth control. Essentially, like having a child is going to be the worst experience you'll ever have. Like that's essentially, yeah. Or it will just scream and cause you to go insane and cry and do awful things. So,
I mean, that's accurate. So,
I mean, right? But I have to say, on a visual level, absolutely striking black and white cinematography.
yes.
And the sound work alone is just like incredible and visceral. And oh god, just thinking about it like crawls under my skin.
Yeah, that suffers from bias in the same way that something like Suspiria would, where it's too much for the sensitivities of a lot of the Academy. Probably.
Yeah. I'm certainly not thinking that it would have gotten anywhere near Oscar, but at the same time, it has certainly endured in a way. So, and it's very, it's like that cover image of, the hair up is very iconic. So, we could mention Suspiria here too. Obviously, Suspiria was in the news because of the remake. This is now last year, we should say. But the original is certainly an interesting sort of cult film. The ADR has always bothered me on Suspiria because it is very obvious and like the entire thing was overdubbed. But like I said, kind of on a visual level, it definitely holds up and all those bright reds are really striking. And like the barbed wire stuff is really visceral and ugh. And so I think the visuals and the sound certainly hold up well, but the acting and the ADR dialogue work is very bad.
Yeah, that was, I can't, I'm trying to think if there's anything to add to that. No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I can't defend it, I can't.
Yeah, it's a wild movie. Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else on your list. I would just mention Smokey and the Bandit because it's kind of fun.
It is a fun movie. I like that one.
Yeah, and Sally Field is great.
Yes.
And Burt Reynolds. Yeah.
They were just magic together. They were so much fun.
Yes. Talk about chemistry. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
And that gets into film editing, which is kind of cool.
It did. And, I think that's a good place to nominate it.
Yeah.
There's some other ones. Did you ever see Grand Theft Auto, Ron Howard's I think it was his directorial debut.
No, I have not, actually.
It's not good.
Okay.
It's not good. But a lot of fun to watch.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Another movie I actually really enjoy is Fun with Dick and Jane.
Ooh.
Jane Fonda and George Siegel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically, they actually did a remake with Jim Carrey a couple of years ago. It's fine. But yeah, it's basically this couple that, they have money problems and they end up, stealing. They end up figuring out ways to rob. I'm trying to remember exactly how it went down, but anyway, there's theft, a lot of money theft involved. It's just a funny movie.
Yeah.
I remember really liking it a lot.
Well, I'm pretty much out, to be honest. I haven't seen too many movies from this year outside of that, so
yeah,
wasn't my favorite.
Yeah, I like The Spy Who Loved Me. I think that's probably
The Spy Who Loved Me. Yeah, and like we said, nobody does it better. One of the better Bond songs.
Yeah, I mean that was my favorite Roger Moore movie, so I like it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So when we come back, we will be discussing whether we think Annie Hall deserved Best Picture or if Star Wars should have taken it.
The films nominated for the Academy Award this year are Annie Hall, Jack Rollins, Charles H. Jaffe Productions, United Artists, Charles H. Jaffe producer. The Goodbye Girl, Ray Stark production, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Ray Stark producer. Julia, a 20th Century Fox production, 20th Century Fox, Richard Roth producer. Star Wars, a 20th Century Fox production, 20th Century Fox, Gary Kurtz producer. The Turning Point, Hera Productions, 20th Century Fox, Herbert Ross and Arthur Lawrence producers. And the winner is Annie Hall, Charles H. Jaffe.
And we're back. So now we will be revealing our verdict as to whether Annie Hall deserved Best Picture or if Star Wars should have taken it. Karen Peterson, your verdict.
Well, I kind of already spoiled that, but
Yeah.
I think it's definitely Star Wars. I think that, I mean, like I said, I understand why people like Annie Hall, but when you look at the cultural relevance, the one that really has kind of created a whole new genre, and it just has done so much for the industry, and I think that Star Wars is definitely the better of the two. I think it, because like what we were talking about earlier, I think that when it comes down to it, it's not just the story, it's not just the acting, it's the whole package. And as a film, Star Wars is just so ambitious and so big and so robust and just so full of great things all working together. And I don't know how you don't recognize that.
Yeah, that's a great argument. I actually really love both Star Wars and Annie Hall. So this is very tough for me. Like I said, I would probably do a split, but at the same time, I'm also someone who is comfortable with a movie not necessarily being the best, quote unquote, whatever that means, but also winning Best Picture because of its impact and its cultural relevance and what it means for the movies of 1977 and beyond, obviously. And so for that reason, I think I would also choose Star Wars.
Yay!
Because yes, Annie Hall is great. I think it's obviously one of his best films by far. But I just feel like Star Wars has just done so much for the industry, and you can say for better or for worse. There are arguments for both, and I understand both completely. But I just feel like this was Star Wars. Like, this was the year of Star Wars. Time magazine even had a story saying it was the best film of the year. It was the defining film of the year. So for all those reasons, I would be comfortable saying that Star Wars should have won.
I like it.
Great. And when it comes to any of these other Best Picture nominees, none of them come close. Sorry, but that's just how it is. I would actually consider... I was going to say, I would actually consider Close Encounters as far as like being up there. And I would have been fine with that winning as well, but...
Yeah, I think that's the only other film that besides Star Wars, I'd be like, yeah, this definitely should have been, like, if it were between those two, I would be torn. Because they're both so great for similar reasons and very different reasons.
Right, exactly. So there you have it. This was our first big episode of 2019, really. So I want to thank you, Karen, for helping me out here. You did a great job, and...
Thank you so much for having me. And anytime I can come on and talk about movies I love, I'm happy to do so.
Yes. So tell people where they can find you on the internet.
Well, I am on the easiest way is on Twitter at Karen M. Peterson or Instagram. And actually this week I'm sharing all kinds of fun stuff from Sundance. And from Twitter, you can find links to my work at AwardsCircuit.com, the Watch and Talk podcast, and the Citizen Dame podcast.
Very good. And if you want to hear more from her as well, also on this show, we have her on the Little Miss Sunshine podcast and the Piano podcast, 2 films that you had very different opinions on.
Yes.
So, yeah, you get the wide range of Karen Peterson's taste. Okay, so you can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The podcast is at Oscar Runner Up. The show is on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Play. Rate, review, subscribe, and now I'll leave it up to you listening to decide whether you think Annie Hall deserved Best Picture or if Star Wars deserved it. And you can do that by going to my website at filmtrophies.com or emailing me at filmtrophies@gmail.com. So once again, thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much. This is fun.
Yes. And I will bid you all adieu.